Welcome to the Kapital News. I am your host, Alex Kreitis. Today is October 17th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. The title of today's podcast is A No Ceasefire, and this is because we have an alleged, and I use the word alleged on purpose, we have an alleged ceasefire that was brokered by Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo with their Turkish counterparts, specifically President Erdogan, that the Turkish military will comply with this alleged ceasefire, or at least a pause in the action. And the reason I am calling this an alleged ceasefire is because Turkish authorities are not calling it a ceasefire. They're saying this is just a pause in the action. A pause in the action until what? Until the United States discusses with the Kurds and Syrian forces to remove the Kurds from their current positions, basically moving them deeper into Syria, which is exactly what the Turkish authorities want, which is why they invaded northern Syria, because they wanted to push back the Kurds from the border. So this was basically negotiating some sort of surrender of an ally of the United States. Now, we can go back and forth as to how serious an ally they are, but nevertheless, we gave the Kurds intelligence, we gave them munitions, we gave them training, and they did most of the heavy lifting. That was the alleged agreement between the United States and the Kurdish forces. We give them money and munitions and intelligence, and they give us fighting soldiers who did most of the fighting, who suffered most of the casualties and most of the deaths. And then, of course, we had this big hiccup with Donald Trump shooting from the hip, saying, hey, well, you know what? Back in 2016, I was campaigning about ending these endless wars. Well, we've been in Syria for quite a while. I'm just going to remove the remaining troops from Syria. And then, of course, he's going to move them into Saudi Arabia and other surrounding countries. So much for ending endless wars and bringing everybody home if you're just going to move them from one country to another. So that's a little perplexing, but nevertheless, that's what's going on here. And of course, this caused a big hiccup. This drummed up a whole bunch of bipartisanship support, if you can believe it, with Democrats and Republicans both saying that this cannot stand. This is not a good move. Now, again, we can have the argument and question the wisdom of these Democrats and Republicans, because a lot of them are the same people who voted to send us to Iraq and who wanted to keep us there until kingdom come. So there's arguments to be made on both sides. We're for peace and prosperity here at the Kapital News. I want these endless wars to end, but you can't shoot from the hip. You have to have a strategy. Because when you move U.S. forces, and then all of a sudden, Turkey invades another country, you have to ask yourself what was on that conversation? What was on that phone call between Donald Trump and Erdogan? Because the United States and Donald Trump is saying, well, I never gave them a green light to go in and invade Syria and push back the Kurds. No, I never said anything like that. Then why did they do it? Why did they do it? Was there a wink, wink, nod, nod? President Erdogan, you're a great, fantastic leader. You're a strong man. You have to do what you have to do. And, we'll see what happens. I mean, that could have been the conversation. And Erdogan could have said, yeah, I am a strong leader. I am a strong man. I am responsible for Turkey and for its borders and for its security. Yeah, I am going to do what we have to do, and I'm going to invade Syria. Because Donald Trump said, yeah, you got to do what you got to do, and we'll see what happens. Who knows? All I'm saying is if you want to understand this, we got to get that phone call. We have to understand those transcripts, okay? Because what Donald Trump essentially did was allowed the Kurds to be massacred, to cause a refugee problem where hundreds of thousands of Syrians had to flee because the Turkey military was coming in to do business. This is not a good setup, folks. Again, end these endless wars, but have a program in place to do it so this type of stuff doesn't happen. At least make it known to your counterparts around the world. You can do it privately, of course, but you should probably do it publicly to some extent too, just to make it known that, look, here's a red line, don't cross it. Do not cross it. And again, you might be a little hesitant with the red line business, going back to Barack Obama in having some countries and some other forces cross that red line, and of course Obama didn't do anything. Now Donald Trump's a different character. Maybe they take him more seriously on these things, but nevertheless, you get my point. Don't allow these types of things to happen, especially to a group of people who have been fighting on our behalf and with us. That's my point. It's just not good policy. It doesn't look good. It makes it, it gives more ammunition to Donald Trump's critics to say he's just doing this he has no idea what he's doing. He's deflecting. He's trying to do this. So we're not paying attention to the impeachment inquiry. It's divert, distract, divide. That's what he's a master at. I mean, all this guy does is gives his enemies and detractors more gasoline to fuel the fire. And I don't know why he does it. And another thing that caused another little bit of division today was Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff and the current director of the Office of Management and Budget, two very important positions within our government. And Mick Mulvaney gave a press conference today at the White House. Donald Trump was out traveling pretty much in Texas today. And Mick Mulvaney pretty much put his foot in his mouth today. He did not say verbatim quid pro quo, but he basically said that political favors are offered all of the time, and the administration was withholding funding to Ukraine unless they gave us something in return, which pretty much by definition is quid pro quo. Now, you would say, well, no big deal. Maybe this wasn't anything to sneeze at. Well, then why did the White House and Mick Mulvaney issue another statement some hours later today, stating there is no and there never has been any quid pro quo? Because Donald Trump has been saying there is no quid pro quo, there is no quid pro quo, yada, yada, yada. Now Mick Mulvaney comes out, and he doesn't use those words, quid pro quo, but he explains a quid pro quo. And then he has to come out later on and retract the statement. So there's some problems going down at the White House, folks. I mean, timely again here at the Capital News. We had a podcast the other day, the White House and damage control. This is a continuing pattern here. You're starting to pick up on it. Something is not right. Something is definitely not right. So we'll see what happens with Mick Mulvaney if he holds on to his positions. I mean, the other thing that sort of caught my attention during some of that press conference that I caught, these people in the White House are, I think, under a lot of stress. And, I mean, these are stressful positions to begin with. Recently, I've seen, obviously, Mick Mulvaney today, maybe a week or two ago, I saw an advisor to Donald Trump, Kellyanne Conway. She was outside on the White House grounds giving a little presser herself, maybe a dozen reporters, and she was on edge. I mean, you could just tell when somebody is on edge. This woman was on edge, Kellyanne Conway. Her attitude towards these reporters was extremely combative and disrespectful. I mean, these reporters were doing their job. They were asking questions. Their questions were not with attitude. They were not asked with any tone of disrespect as far as I could tell. But her responses to them and answers and non-answers were highly disrespectful, and somebody who's pretty much on edge. And sort of the same thing, maybe not to that degree, but sort of that same edginess I was picking up with Mick Mulvaney. Now, you have to understand, the press corps, they're not huge fans of Donald Trump. I get it. But, they're supposed to ask tough questions. That's their job. They're supposed to make people in power uncomfortable. That's their job. The press is supposed to be doing that on behalf of we the people, to keep the people that we place in power honest. Okay? And we have a problem right now, which goes back, I'm not picking on the Trump administration, but we got a big problem in the Trump administration where there is a very loose relationship with the truth. We have exaggerated. This is why there are not daily press briefings, because people don't want to go out there on a daily basis and have to lie on behalf of Donald Trump. You had Sean Spicer, you had Sarah Sanders Huckabee. I mean, these people were butchered on a daily basis because they're trying to do their job and trying to remain loyal to the president. But in doing so, they're making themselves look like buffoons because of all of the exaggerations and lies that they are spewing on his behalf. So now we don't have these daily press briefings like we're supposed to, or like we should. I mean, there's no law in the books that say we have to, but it does bring a semblance of transparency. And when you have Donald Trump saying he's the most transparent president ever, well, then have a press briefing every day. Not by you. You can have a press secretary. But you understand the problem here, and it's not good. So you have a lot of people within this White House that are seemingly on edge, especially when they talk to the media. It's almost like this is sort of like the television show, The Game of Thrones. I mean, everybody is conspiring against everybody. It's like being on the game show Survivor, who outwit, outlast, outsurvive, basically. I mean, this is not a good environment for the country. And again, when you have a lot of people out there who are saying that the White House is in chaos, and then you see top-level senior advisors to the president, Kellyanne Conway, Mick Mulvaney, having a conversation with the press corps and being on edge, well, now it just, again, gives more ammunition to his detractors to say, see, we told you so. This is just not good. So much of this is self-inflicted when it doesn't have to be. And it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, because all this does is further divides the country, because everybody just gets moved further into their silos. See, this is quid pro quo. See, they are on edge. See, it is chaotic. See that picture with Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump the other day. It's a meltdown. She storms out with the Democratic Party. He's breaking down. He's having a huge meltdown. We have to pray for this president. Donald Trump tweets out immediately thereafter. She's the one having a breakdown. You can't make this stuff up. This is not healthy for this republic at all. At all. So that's sort of that. So we have the Mick Mulvaney mess up. We have this no ceasefire, which is supposed to last for 120 hours, 5 days. And guess what happens at the end of the 5 days, folks? We said this yesterday, because yesterday it was sort of just a take a step back, take a deep breath podcast. President Erdogan of Turkey is going to meet Vladimir Putin of Russia in 5 days. Coincidental? You think that's coincidental? And again, this is pretty much a no ceasefire. This is just a pause in the action. And again, we have Donald Trump out there saying that this is saving millions and millions of lives. Nobody else could do this. Nothing else ever happened. Look, this was never an issue until a couple of weeks ago. This was never an issue. This is very much akin to what we talk about here on previous podcasts with the U.S.-China trade war. I have a whole host of issues with China. They're not good people, especially, and really I mean the Chinese Communist Party. And a whole host of things that's going on in that economy. It's a big charade. They will be coming down. In fact, we have Chinese third quarter GDP growth at its weakest in 27 and a half years. Weakest GDP growth in 27 and a half years. And of course, Thunder Thumbs, if he hasn't already done so this evening, will be tweeting about that and congratulating himself for bringing down the great Chinese economic miracle. Now, of course, they were coming down under their own weight, believe me when I tell you, but Thunder Thumbs is going to take full credit for this if he hasn't already. But Thunder Thumbs, again, wants to take credit for this great and fantastic ceasefire, saying nobody else could have solved this riddle, and nobody has solved this riddle for the past 10 years. Only I, Donald Trump, could do so. This was not a problem, ladies and gentlemen, of Turkey invading Syria and massacring the Kurds and pushing them back further into Syria until Donald Trump shot from the hip and said, we're out. So just like the U.S.-China trade war, Donald Trump goes in, breaks something, farmers are going bankrupt, industrial plants are shutting down, steel prices, aluminum prices are collapsing. Again, if you follow this podcast, completely predictable, and we've talked about this numerous amounts of times, highly predictable, but it's happened nonetheless. And yet Donald Trump wants to say that this is the greatest economy ever. When you get a short blip from the protection of tariffs, he's going flying around saying, oh, well, somebody's opening a steel mill. Let's go down there and have a photo opportunity. But he ain't back there 3-6 months later when it's shutting down. Okay? We talk about that. We predicted that. We go back and look at listen to the podcasts. All right? This is highly predictable. So Donald Trump comes in, breaks something, then he wants to pat himself on the back when he fixes it or gives the appearance that he has fixed it. You can't make this stuff up. Can't make this stuff up, but this is what we're dealing with, and we will continue to be jerked around with this U.S.-China trade talk as well as we make our way through phase one, and then we have, the Federal Reserve stuff coming out at the end of the month, and then it's going to be down in Chile to meet with President Xi, and maybe there's going to be a signing ceremony down there, so buckle up. I mean, this is so much the Twilight Zone and Groundhog Day, you can't even make it up. So we're going to be strapped in for the next month and a half on this at the very least. On the market front, the markets were somewhat relatively muted today. Still no big headline market-moving news, the S&P was up about 0.3%. The Dow was flat for the day. The NASDAQ was up about 0.4%. The big mover was the Russell 2000, the small cap index, which saw another gain of 1.1% for the day. But not a lot of movement in the broader markets. Some of the bigger news that came out today is there is a quote-unquote deal surrounding Brexit. So Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, was able to secure a deal with his counterparts within the European Union. I'm not going to bore you with the details. I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty like I did at the beginning of this podcast when I started this podcast back in February when Brexit had a hard deadline at the end of March. So I said, you know what, this is current news. This is interesting stuff on a number of fronts, financial news, economic news, for the sanctity of democracy, a whole host of issues that I thought important surrounding Brexit. And so with the audience, I was getting down with the nitty-gritty and all the details and talking about the changes. I'm not going to do that this time. I'm not going to bore you with it because we were lied to back then. We might be lied to now. Because while there is a deal between the PM, Johnson, and his counterparts within the European Union, this has to go back to British Parliament. Well, British Parliament shot down the former PM, Theresa May's deal that she had secured with the EU. Well, now it's Boris Johnson's turn to go back to Parliament, and they have to vote for it. And we already know that members of the Irish party within Parliament, they've already said we're not voting for this. They don't like it. So now this makes it much more difficult for Boris Johnson to get the votes to pass this thing. So if he can't pass this thing within a couple of days, I think Saturday is going to be the vote, or at least the debate on it, then he has won absolutely nothing. And what is he going to do? Because Parliament has passed a law that is not allowing the UK to leave without a deal. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is what I'm talking about. This is the seriousness and the sanctity of democracy. That's why I've said months ago, if they continue to kick this can down the road or they somehow get to another referendum, that there has to be a revolution and there has to be a revolt on behalf of the British people, because this cannot stand. It cannot stand. Here is where you have to put aside your pocketbook and economics, and you have to believe in the greater good, and you have to believe in the institution of democracy and people's right and ability to govern themselves. That's why I focus on Brexit. But right now, we're not going to go into all the details. I'm not going to bore you with them. If this thing passes, then we'll have a conversation on it. And I will surely keep you updated. But the only thing that really moved in the markets today surrounding that was the British pound. It caught quite the bid. So we'll see how that transpires moving forward as well. What else do I want to talk about here? Some other news surrounding the White House. We have Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, also the former governor of Texas and former presidential contender. He will be resigning by the end of the year. His resignation is clouded. It's a little confusing to me. I've honestly have not done a lot of research in this, but just from sort of basically going through the headlines and hearing a few snippets here and there, he somehow was involved with this Ukrainian phone call and Rudy Giuliani and talking to his counterparts in the Ukraine for God knows what. But it appears that Rick Perry is some sort of fall guy here. He's basically a useful idiot, if you will, in regards to this whole Ukrainian thing. I really don't know his role in this. Will he be subpoenaed? Probably. He'll probably be subpoenaed. Will he comply with a congressional subpoena? We don't know at this juncture. But he's likely to end up in the mix because if he's resigning, it's simply showing that something must be askew, or he's trying to divert some of the attention away from Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and some other inner circle allies of Donald Trump, and sort of going to take some of the heat. For what? Again, I don't really know, so my apologies for that, but at least he will be resigning at the end of the year, and I'm going to have to look into it with a whole host of other people who have been continuing to testify before congressional committees as well. Nice segue, I guess, in the name of congressional committees. We have Congressman Elijah Cummings, who passed away this evening. He was the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. There were a lot of podcasts where I, was strongly against some of his statements and some of his maneuvering. A lot of it, in my opinion, was politics. But now with a lot of things coming to light, I happen to agree with him on a number of things. But I'm sure he will be missed. He was 68 years old. May he rest in peace. Lastly, what I would like to talk about here is an article out of Vanity Fair. And this was written by William or Bill Cohen. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's on the financial media every once in a while. He's written a few books in regards to the financial crisis of 08-09, a former banker. So he has some inside knowledge on the sector and is obviously also an author and columnist. Well, finally, something in the mainstream here is calling into question what we have been talking about here for months, is the market manipulation surrounding Donald Trump and his tweets. Because according to the article and according to an interview that he gave this evening on CNBC, I'm not sure if he was on other financial stations or not this evening, but I know he was on CNBC because I watched that interview myself this evening. And he's basically saying, look, I got a phone call from some traders. I verified their credibility, and they're concerned that this needs to be investigated because these traders pinpointed a few big trades on the futures markets in regards to the S&P 500 and the timing of them and the amount of money that could have potentially have been made either going long the market or going short the market are astronomical. In fact, if they timed it beautifully and got out at the peak, upside, downside, they could have, these traders, either an individual, but probably a group of traders because of the amount of money, could have made billions of dollars over the span of a couple days, a few days, a week. So not a very long time horizon here. And you have these big moves in the futures markets in regards to the S&P, to the upside and to the downside, following Donald Trump's tweets in regards to the U.S.-China trade. Now, in the interview, Bill Cohen said, look, I am not alleging anything. I am not saying that Donald Trump is involved with insider trading or is involved with some sort of market manipulation. All I am saying is this is an observation. I received phone calls from traders who monitor this stuff, who say something is not right here, people who have been doing this for decades, who are noticing this amount of volume, this amount of money that could potentially be being made in such a very short time. It just seems too coincidental to be coincidence. That's all he's saying. He's saying he called up the requisite authorities who he would have had to have called, who would be investigating this, the SEC, the CFTC, the Communities Futures Trading Commission, and other agencies, and they all said there's nothing to see here. They gave him no comment, basically. Also on CNBC, following this interview, they had a former SEC attorney. And according to this attorney, he says this should be investigated. Now, it's going to be a high bar to prove that there is insider trading or some other market manipulation, but nevertheless, this can and should be investigated. And that's all that I have ever said on this podcast, that this should be investigated. If there's nothing there, then there's nothing there, if it's an honest investigation. But you cannot have a president tweeting like this, manipulating the markets as far as I'm concerned, and getting away with it. Because he knows what he's going to tweet. He knows what he's going to say. He knows if it's going to be positive or he knows if it's going to be negative. Who's to say he's not calling somebody up or having them there in the White House in person, and then they go out into the markets and they bet accordingly. And over the course of a couple days, a week, they're billionaires. They're billionaires. And that's no exaggeration if they're timing it right when they get out of the market, out of their position. And that's serious because that is a blatant abuse of power if it is true. I think in and of itself, just the tweets, because the man is obsessed with the stock market. We all know this. I mean, you'd be lying to yourself if you think otherwise. He talks about it all the time. He tweets about it all the time. He sends his minions out there to talk about it all the time. He knows the effect of his tweets on the markets. That in and of itself is an abuse of power, in my opinion, which in and of itself needs to be investigated. Whether somebody's actually making money off of it is another question, and you'd have to look into those brokerage firms. You'd have to look into those individuals, which would be found out in an investigation. And then you ask, well, what did you just get lucky? How many times did you do this? Because you have to understand something too, ladies and gentlemen. On September 11th, 2001, before those attacks, there was an increase in volume on the options markets surrounding airline firms and some financial institutions who had offices in the Twin Towers. People made out like bandits because they had knowledge that something was going to take place. Because they were buying puts, which a put is basically selling the stock short, but you can lever up in the options markets, and you can make a lot more money in options than you can outright just owning or selling short those shares. In this case, it was the airline companies and a few financial firms. So this is what happens. This is what the SEC exists to do. This is what the CFTC exists to do. This is what the FBI can exist to do. These are investigations because if you have foreknowledge, you have insider trading, you can make a lot of money. You could make a lot of money. And that's all we're talking about here. Investigate it, which is exactly what the author of this article, Bill Cohen, was stating throughout his interview. These are observations. This has been going on. It's documented. There's a timeline. You got a president who's obsessed with the markets. This is market manipulation. Is it insider trading? That's the question, but it needs to be investigated, and we agree with that here. And lastly, I know I just said lastly on that one, but there is a tentative deal between General Motors and the UAW. This now has to go to a vote to the actual employees who have been on strike to ratify the deal and then to move forward. If this is ratified, I do believe the UAW is then moving on to Ford and Fiat Chrysler. So there could be a problem with Ford and Fiat Chrysler as well, potentially. Now, in this tentative deal, the UAW is getting some better perks for their employees, benefits, pay, that type of stuff. But GM is still going to be closing down, I believe, potentially 3 plants. 3 plants. So are the employees going to go for that? We're going to find out. I do believe this will continue on for at least another week or two until all of the votes are tallied, and we'll go from there. And, of course, we will keep you updated. So no ceasefire. He breaks it, he fixes it, and says it's the best thing ever. This won't be the last of this. I can assure you this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe, get the word out, and leave your comments. We do love hearing from you. Stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Kapital News. I am Alex Kurdish. Godspeed.